no surprise that newsmakers try to manipulate the audience. They want you to believe that they are the one holding the line and they'll use any trick they can to get you there. But don't let them fool you. Get unspun. I'm Amanda Sturgill. I've been a reporter, and today I teach future reporters to cut the spin and think critically about what newsmakers say. My podcast, UnSpun, shows you how to know when you're being manipulated by the news. Learn to spot the tricks and how to make up your own mind about what's true. So if you're tired of being fooled by the news, subscribe to UnSpun today. UnSpun, because you deserve the truth.
Our press secretary gave alternative facts to that.
My goal in this deposition was to be truthful, but not particularly helpful.
Welcome to UnSpun, the podcast that makes you better at finding the truth. The way people get news is changing. It used to be that there were many reporters who would research stories and write articles, but now politicians and famous people share information directly with you on social media and the internet. That means you find out things fast, but it's up to you to make sure the information's actually accurate. And newsmakers don't always do their part. The temptation to manipulate information is strong. They bend the truth to deceive so that they can avoid accountability, so that they can advance their agendas. When you recognize these agendas, you can sometimes find out what's real. And we're at a crossroads where anyone can share anything online, so it's important to sharpen your critical thinking skills. Finding that deception before it goes viral is pretty much a survival skill now, and we're going to do it together. Let's get unspun. Hello, Truth Seekers, and welcome to this week's episode of UnSpun. It's been a big week on social media already, and it's only Monday. In some ways, we're seeing things come together that have been building up for a long time. So this week, I want to talk to you about the role of influencers in shaping what people know about what is going on in their government. Sound good? Let's get unspun. Here's a clip of the current president of the United States.
I have two segments I want to do with you.
Okay.
The first one is use one word that comes to mind to describe that person. Okay? It's a fun game.
Fun.
Let's start. All right. Who is the first picture? And we got the Note Boys. One word.
Oh, great.
I love that. Okay.
Really
Great.
good.
Okay.
So you're friends with them?
Yeah.
Are they competitors of yours though?
Not even, honestly. Every time that I speak to Kyle or Steve, it's just only
they're all
they're really
no, they're just great.
Yeah.
But in a way, you would be competitors, but you don't.
They're more bigger on the YouTube side of things. I'm more live, so it's a lot. It's a different world, but it's kind of like parallel.
Look at them. I mean, they're just great people. That was Dana White. He said, "You got to do them." I said, "Who are they?" I didn't know. And after I did them, it was like an explosion.
All right, let's see what we got next here. We got me.
Yeah. Well, I can just tell you that one word would be outstanding. My sons told me about you, and they told me about how big Dad. My Baron.
Yeah.
He said, "Dad, he's really big."
So that is Donald Trump being interviewed by online streamer Aiden Ross. Ross became famous when he was playing video games on Twitch, which is an online service where you broadcast yourself live. He's grown to be really influential, interviewing and collaborating with celebrities and right-wing influencers like Nick Fuentes. And that clip was Ross interviewing former president/candidate Donald Trump in August of 2024. At its peak, 500,000 people watched this stream. Now, this is an audio podcast, but if you look at the video of the stream, it really has some interesting symbolism. Trump is sitting at a microphone next to Ross, and Ross is wearing a Make America Great Again hat, but otherwise is essentially dressed in a Donald Trump costume, with a navy blue jacket, a white shirt, or red tie. And then in the background are about 30 people who basically look like a small Trump rally crowd. The back row are all wearing suits. About a third of them are wearing MAGA hats. Some of them have the mugshot Never Surrender poster, and there are two giant American flags in the background. Trump's appearance was even nominated for an award. And you should know that Barron did tell his father the truth. Ross is quite influential. Wikipedia lists him as in the top 30 Twitch streamers around the world, in the category various games and chatting. Now, I went into some detail about his background because I realized that a lot of the people who listen to UnSpun may not be familiar with prominent Twitch streamers. And as you can hear from the clip, the president was also not familiar with Aiden Ross until his son Barron told him that Ross was, quote, big. And this wasn't Trump's only appearance on an influencer's channel. He has spent a good amount of time with different influencers, including Logan Paul, a live interview with Elon Musk on X, and more. It's an example from the campaign of an outreach program where the campaigns are trying to get their candidates in front of anyone that they can who might have a large audience of voters. I kind of see that as an extension of candidates appearing on late night comedy talk shows. As a digital communication strategist named Tammy Good told PBS, these smaller but still significant celebrities offer a real advantage when they produce content on a digital platform because you can already know a great deal about their audience, so you can really target the messages. And those messages can go to audiences that might be a little bit harder to reach, like younger Americans who, let's face it, are not watching the 6 o'clock news. And of course, it's not just Trump. So it makes me wonder, what role are influencers playing in the political world? I am recording this on April the 13th of 2026, and last week, one of the president's truths lashed out at some of his influencer supporters. He said that those influencers think it's wonderful for Iran, a state sponsor of terror, to have a nuclear weapon, quoting saying, "I know why Tucker Carlson, Megyn Kelly, Candace Owens, and Alex Jones have all been fighting me for years, especially because they have one thing in common, low IQs. They're stupid people, and they know it, their families know it, and everyone else knows it too." And he goes on. Now, as we learned in elementary school, I hope, you don't bother to lash out against people who don't matter to you. You lash out when you care. And so the president is seeing some influencers who are criticizing his actions, and he cares. Research from the Pew Research Center from 2024, called America's News Influencers, found that around 20% of Americans reported regularly using influencers to get their news. And that's 1 in 5 people overall, and even more for young people, where it's about a third of them. So influencers could maybe have a lot of power. But at the same time, that same Pew study showed that more than 70% of the influencers that they studied were independent of any kind of larger news organization. Now, I did a whole other episode on this, which I can link to in the show notes. But basically, when news is created outside of an organization, you have some things that happen to its quality. You don't have the benefit of an organization providing things like fact checking, and you don't have the threat of an organization imposing moral standards on how you do your work. It's kind of a two-headed thing. Working independently means you can follow stories that are important, but it might be hard to convince an editor to spend resources on. So, these freelance works can be more in depth, they can cover more topics, things like that. And that could be a good thing for the audience. But you also don't have some elements of quality control that you might have from an organization. Independent journalists can also be more at work. But an influencer could be a whole different animal entirely. So who are news influencers? One way you can think of them is as opinion leaders. That's a media studies term, and in the corporate world, we sometimes call them thought leaders. If you've been an UnSpun listener for a while, you will know that I've talked about the idea of agenda setting and agenda building. Basically, it's the idea that the media does not necessarily tell you what to think, but it does tell you what to think about. And we have a lot of research showing that people form their opinions, at least somewhat, based on what people that they know think. A lot of times, you'll have one person who's very informed on an issue, and other people will sort of outsource their research to that other person. You can think of the media as working in this way, as they pick what stories are actually fit to print and which ones are not worth following up on. But there will also be people in your life who may serve in that role. It may be your friend who pays to subscribe to media outlets. It may be a faith leader, a community leader like a PTA president. There's a lot of different choices. And as we spend more time online, we're also finding these opinion leaders online. So when those opinion leaders can sway a large number of people, we start to think of them as influencers. Now, that Pew report cites other research they've done that found that Republicans tend to believe that social media sites censor conservatives. In this study, influencers seem to be more politically right based on account bios and websites and things like that. Now, about half didn't express a political orientation, but of the other half, a third of them were right-leaning and a fifth were left-leaning. And this was especially true on Facebook, where there were 3 times as many conservative news influencers than there were liberal ones. Another thing that I learned from that Pew study is that a lot of influencers are men, particularly in the area of commentary on politics. In fact, men outnumber women close 2 to 1. An interesting exception to this is TikTok. When people looked at where influencers are active, X was far and away the winner. Now keep in mind that influencers can and do create content on multiple sites, but 85% of them in this study had content on X. The next biggest was Instagram, which was about half, followed by YouTube and Facebook. Facebook had about a third. TikTok came in at number 6, just ahead of LinkedIn, of all places. TikTok was especially interesting, though. First of all, the gender balance was close to equal on TikTok, and this was not true on any other network. TikTok was also less politically biased to the right. In fact, there were slightly more left-leaning accounts on TikTok than right-leaning accounts. So it's getting interesting. I need to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll focus on how influencers interact with their audiences and what that means for you and the people you come into contact with every day. I'll be right back. Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about the big landscape of people who run influencer accounts, and we found that influencers are the most active on X, that they tend to be male, and they tend to be conservative. Now, this is, of course, not to say that you don't find influencers on other platforms, or that you don't find women or people with other political perspectives. In fact, I think it's really important to remember that about half of the influencers that Pew studied were actually neutral, right? So they weren't really promoting one view or the other. I think some of this is because of the source of some of the influencers themselves. Because there are many influencers who have moved into that role after having had a career in the media. In the 2010s, I think Dan Rather was a good example of that. Dan Rather was the anchor of the CBS Evening News for 24 years. And he became that after he did some really important coverage, like covering the Kennedy assassination from Dallas, covering Watergate, and more. So he was a major figure in news. And he actually left the anchor desk after he allowed documents in a news report on President George W. Bush to air that turned out to be fakes. Well, today, Dan Rather has 3.5 million followers on Facebook, and he does still create news there. Here's an example.
But here's the point. All of these are part of the broad historical context in which this second indictment of President Trump is taking place. Good time to stop and consider that what the country has to do, there's nothing original or huge about this, and understanding of it, just remind ourselves, the broad middle of the country, left, right, and center, the moderate, decent, overwhelming majority of the country, those not on the extreme left or right, have to hold themselves together, be steady, trust the process of our institutions, hope the institutions hold, and hope the right outcome comes out of all this. It's unquestionably going to be another unprecedented year of challenge and opportunity for America, and for that matter, for the world.
Your belief about political bias in that clip is going to depend on the political bias you carried in when you listened to it. But I do think most of us can agree that he is making an effort to be neutral, and that is a hallmark of influencers who came over from the media. They tend to carry forward the ethical standard of non-bias. And honestly, truth seekers, I have to say, I feel this a little bit myself. I wouldn't call myself any kind of a big influencer, but I definitely do feel like I need to follow the journalistic ethic of seeking truth with the understanding that truth can be messy and does not always let you make points based on beliefs you had going in. There's a seemingly endless supply of criticism of the mainstream media for not being assertive enough in their coverage of one side or the other. Attempts to be neutral are in themselves seen as bias, and maybe they are. The day before I recorded this, the President of the United States published a lengthy post on TruthSocial criticizing the current Pope, Pope Leo, for being, quote, weak on crime. And then he followed that post with a post of an AI-generated image of Trump as some sort of Jesus healing the sick, while angels who looked like soldiers were hovering in the sky above him. And if you looked at the headline, in most major news outlets, it said something like the President and the Pope were sparring. As a member of the audience, I think you might have a beef here, because Leo's statement was that war is bad, and Trump's statement was that the Pope is bad. So one is talking about ideas, and the other is talking about a person, or the sparring is kind of one-sided. But you will see a lot of criticism of mainstream media about things like that. I did an earlier episode on sand washing that you might want to check out. All right, so with that said, it brings me to another characteristic of influencer coverage. Influencer coverage feels different from coverage in the mass media, and that can make influencers more influential because trust in legacy media has been and continues to slide. In fact, recent reports show that trust in legacy media has hit a record low. Well, why is this? Well, a big reason is because audiences think that traditional media is politically biased. This is more true of Republicans than it is of Democrats. 54% of Democrats say they trust the media, and only 12% of Republicans do. Another reason is because of changes in the legacy media itself. Because they're reaching their audiences in the same place that disinformation does, social media platforms, legacy media has adopted some of the tactics that disinformation purveyors do in order to survive. So you're seeing headlines that are clickbaity, and that tends to feel more biased. You'll also see ambiguous headlines to encourage click-throughs, and sometimes images that are just taken out of context, again, to get those click-throughs. And when you do things like that, It sometimes gives people false associations in messages. Even if the underlying facts are technically true, it just feels misleading. There's also the fact that prominent leaders are consistently discrediting journalism. We saw this going all the way back to Hitler calling the media who reported facts the Lügenpresse, or the lying press. You've seen leaders in the US and Brazil and Hungary and other places where authoritarians want to stay in control, consistently devaluing the news. There are whole parts of the information ecosphere that cannot refer to mainstream journalism as anything but fake news. And this kind of rhetoric encourages supporters to find alternative sources of news so that they can be havens for free speech. A lot of times, these alternative sources are influencers. And then, as the media's taken a big economic hit from both not adapting to new technology and from politics, there's just not as much money to make journalism. And that means that newsrooms are downsizing, so there are fewer editors checking things to make sure they're right, and fewer journalists to create stories. So the media is, in fact, a little bit less accurate, and there are more mistakes, and that does tend to undermine trust. Audiences also like to think they can do their own research, and until fairly recently, it was not the practice of legacy news to take you behind the scenes to see how they're doing their reporting. But when you have a guy who's a Twitch streamer, you can literally see his whole setup right there on the screen. And that does lead to that kind of authenticity, which makes news seem more trustworthy. And then there's a final reason that research has found that I think is surprisingly important. If you think about it, who has the ability to pay for legacy news now? Things that used to be free come with a cost, and that cost seems to be going up. And it's really hard, especially when you're getting important news stories from outlets and places that are far away from you. So, for example, maybe there's important political stuff happening in Florida, or Georgia, or Arizona, or Nevada. These are all places that have been in the news with threats to elections. They all have good local news outlets. And you might want to be able to read those local outlets as they cover the issues in their communities. But I don't want to read news about Nevada every day, and I don't want to read news about Atlanta every day. It's not that I don't care, but I don't really have the time, and the things that are happening on the Atlanta City Council are not really relevant to me when I live in another state. So the financial incentive when I hit a paywall is to just either ignore that news or to find an influencer who has paid for it and is going to just reshare it with me. When it comes to the big national outlets, they are expensive. I think I probably pay about $600 a year in assorted subscriptions, and I do try to keep the number down. That is just not in the budget for a lot of people. Because those big national outlets want to keep my dollars, they're going to cover things they think I'm interested in. So you're not going to find news articles in the New York Times cooking section about how to cook with the food you find at the Dollar Tree. You're going to find articles about how to cook expensive specialty store things like white asparagus. The people who can afford to pay for the New York Times are interested in that kind of stuff. And the people who are cooking with food from the dollar store and the convenience stores don't have $200 a year to pay for a media subscription. So they're going to find their content on YouTube because that's where the influencers are. So in some ways, the economic model has also driven the audience into the arms of influencers. I need to take another very quick break. When I come back, we'll look at how influencers keep their audiences around, and finally, the effect of following news influencers on how educated you are. I'll be right back. Welcome back. Okay, truth seekers, let's talk about parasocial relationships. Did you see what I did there? Before the break, we were talking a little bit about authenticity. The idea that you're getting your information unplanned or unfiltered or just somehow more real. And the fact that you can maybe see a little bit of the world of the influencer, or at least it feels like you can, is part of how they do this. So it's a parasocial relationship. It's a person that you've never met, but you feel like you know them because they seem to share little pieces of their life with you. Maybe if you're lucky, they will engage with you during the live stream or they'll reply to you in the comments. I can always make my students laugh by using some Gen Z lingo, like walking into class and saying, "Hey chat, let's lock in." Calling the people who are watching you the chat is something that you might do on a streaming service. And of course, other creators have nicknames for their audiences, like Logan Paul calling his audience the Low Gang, or some online shows calling their followers patriots, or even that Midwestern mom calling her followers her little marshmallows. And I do that a little bit too by calling you a truth seeker. I hope that's in line with the goal for the podcast, to equip you with better skills to figure out what's going on with the media that you consume. But this was also a deliberate choice that I made. And so, like I said, telling a little bit about themselves with some personal detail or with those behind-the-scenes clips is a way to create that illusion of intimacy between influencers and their audiences. They'll try to be like an everyday person in some cases. And I think that's why influencers will make content from the car, for example. Because who doesn't relate to not having any quiet space in your life except for in the car? They'll use some techniques that they borrow from film, like looking straight into the camera, which is sort of a proxy for eye contact. and some are successful in creating follower communities. For example, this show is hosted on the MSW Media Network, and the creator of that network has also created a fairly active Facebook group. People in that Facebook group largely just talk to each other, but it still creates that sense of group belonging. There can also be an aspect of human branding. So, influencers may always have something similar about their appearance, like a distinctive pair of glasses, for example. They may take you to the process of getting to that look, like those popular Get Ready With Me videos that some influencers will make. Those blend vulnerability with achieving that kind of human visual brand. And that human brand can, of course, be reinforced with things like thumbnails. But generally, influencers have sometimes tailored their personas to match the ideal self of the person in their target audience, according to research. They work to help that member of the audience overcome usually an information challenge, whether that is the best way to understand what's going on in the world or the best way to apply contour. They're reducing complexity out of the world for their audience by acting like they're your own, real life, well informed friend. And so now we need to think about why all this matters. If you get your news from influencers, are there good things about that? Are there bad things? And the answer is yes to both. There's a big trade off between the accessibility that you can get from getting news from influencers and the lack of standards for things like being true or being objective. So I could find out what's going on in a court case in Florida without having to pay for a paywall subscription. But I'd have to do a little bit of work to make sure that the person who's giving me the secondhand information is doing a reliable job. So here's some of the key elements you can think about. Remember, we just talked about complexity reduction or explaining things in a way that's more relatable. Research has actually shown that influencers are better at getting the facts across to some audiences, especially younger ones. This has been true since I was in graduate school. I had a friend who did her master's thesis on MTV News and found that it actually did make the audience more informed. However, research looking at how the general influencer sphere has covered important issues suggests that when it comes to reporting scientific facts or political facts, there is a lot of misinformation that's mixed in with it. Some of that is because most news influencers didn't collect the information themselves. Instead, they're usually taking existing mainstream news and repackaging it in some way. There are some exceptions of people who are using open source intelligence and are actually sort of breaking new news. But when you look at most news influencers today, you're often going to find a kind of a mix, where it is, 80 to 90% repackaging and commentary and maybe 10% actual, like they had a good source or they found a good database or something like that. And then, of course, money matters. The platform, turns out, it shapes a lot of the content, and that is a real problem because the people who are creating the content do not own the platform. Because of this, people are incentivized to package information in particular ways that may not be the best way to convey it for the audience. As an example, one good way to grow an audience, from what I understand, is to post a lot of YouTube shorts because YouTube is good for discovery. People get a feed, and the platform has a fairly knowable way of getting yourself into the feed that they provide to other people. But the company is deciding what those factors are, and those factors may not be in the best interests of information. As I've said many times on UnSpun, the business of a company is making money, not public service. They might have public service as a part of their mission, but fundamentally, if they're not making money, they will no longer exist. So it's existential for them. Anyway, this dynamic of visibility, which is driven by the platform, can make creators prioritize very emotional content, in particular negative emotions like being outraged or indignant or afraid. And this will often incentivize influencers to create really sensational clickbait or to make stories more dramatic than they actually are. And I think a final point I would make is that because a lot of news is provided on social media, the information environment itself is just very fragmented. And this is something you can actually take some control over. If you are letting algorithms provide you with news by throwing people into your feed as suggestions that you then take as your sources of information, you've made your job a lot harder in determining how reliable that information is. Verifying things you see on social with more stable sources like legacy news outlets could help. I realize not everybody is in a position to do that. And I offer praise and honor to people who do subscribe to quality news outlets and share GIF links on social media. That is something that can really help with the information environment quite a bit. So if you get GIF links and don't share them, maybe set some goals that you're going to do that more and use all of your GIF links every month. Another thing you can do just as a social media user is to work your social media not from a feed but from lists. Blue Sky made this kind of easy with curated starter packs. On Facebook, this can be really challenging. On YouTube, checking the accounts that you follow before you check the things in your feed can be really helpful. In this way, you can identify accounts that do tend to have rationally presented, accurate information and just go to those accounts first. And this will help you a lot in getting the good stuff from the information environment. Okay, Truth Seekers, it was great to spend another week with you. I would love to get your feedback on the show. I welcome your comments in the review section of the podcast app where you're listening, and I also welcome your emails. Feel free to write to me at theunspunpodcast@gmail.com. I do always try to write back, positive or negative. I appreciate hearing what's on your mind. Have a great week and stay sharp. Thanks for getting Unspun with me this week. Unspun is a production of me, Amanda Sturgill, and is a proud member of the MSW Media family of podcasts. Send me your thoughts and ideas about trickery in the news on Gmail at theunspunpodcast@gmail.com. I even write back. And find this episode's show notes and more information at theunspunpodcast.substack.com. Want to learn more and get smarter? Check out my book, Detecting Deception, Tools to Fight Fake News, which is available on Amazon or your favorite online bookseller. And until next time, stay sharp, everyone.
It's Sunday morning, and that wonderfully relaxed feeling of a long, lazy day lingers in the air. If you want to make the moment last, may I suggest the perfect solution, the Martin Sheen Podcast. Join me, your host, Martin Sheen, for beautifully crafted 20-minute programs filled with never-before-heard stories of my life, along with personal reflections and poetry that inspires. The Martin Sheen Podcast is the perfect Sunday refresh, a chance to take a deep breath, relax, and know that the stress of Monday may be just around the corner, but not here, not now. So make this your weekly moment of calm as we explore faith, hope, love, and what it means to be human. And know this journey is ever unfolding as I invite you to see what's next with me, Martin Sheen. And thank you.